Amadi stood at the center of the marketplace, the weight of the village's expectations pressing down on him like an invisible burden. His gaze flickered between Ginika, standing defiantly at his side, and Oluchi, the young woman who had been presented to him as a potential second wife. The crowd around them had fallen into a hush, waiting with bated breath for Amadi's decision. Izokoli cleared his throat, breaking the silence. Amadi, the time has come. The village awaits your choice. Will you honor the traditions of your ancestors, or will you defy them? Amadi felt the eyes of the entire village on him, felt the judgment in their gazes. He knew what was expected of him, knew that the easy path was to accept Oluchi as his second wife and secure his place within the village. But as he looked at Ginika, standing tall despite the tears glistening in her eyes, he felt a wave of emotions he hadn't anticipated. He remembered the early days of their marriage, the joy they had shared when Ginika first became pregnant, the hope they had held for the future. He remembered the laughter they had shared, the quiet moments of understanding, and the deep love that had once bound them together. Was he really prepared to throw all of that away for the sake of tradition? But then he thought of the expectations, the relentless pressure from the elders, and the whispers that had been haunting him for months. He thought of the future, the legacy that he was expected to leave behind, and the son that he was supposed to provide. It was not an easy choice, and the conflicting emotions churned within him, threatening to tear him apart. Ginika, sensing his hesitation, reached out and took his hand. Her touch was warm, steadying, and for a moment, Amadi felt a glimmer of hope. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and determination. Amadi, she whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of the wind, whatever you decide today, know that I will always fight for our family. For us. You don't have to do this. We can find another way. Amadi's heart clenched at her words. He could feel the love she still held for him, despite everything they had been through, and it tore at him to think of the pain he was about to cause her. But the expectations of the village were a powerful force, and he knew that once he made his choice, there would be no turning back. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. The marketplace seemed to close in around him, the faces of the villagers blurring together as he focused on the task at hand. He had to make a decision, and he had to make it now. With a heavy heart, Amadi turned to Izokoli, his voice trembling as he spoke. Izokoli, I honor the traditions of our ancestors. But I cannot take Oluchi as my second wife. A murmur rippled through the crowd, a mix of shock and disbelief. Izokoli's eyes widened in surprise, and he glanced at the other elders, who exchanged uncertain looks. This was not the outcome they had anticipated, and for a moment, the village seemed to be suspended in time. You refuse? Izokoli stammered, clearly taken aback. Amadi, do you understand the consequences of your decision? I do, Amadi replied, his voice growing stronger. But I cannot betray the woman I love. Ginika is my wife, and Ife is my daughter. I will not abandon them, no matter what the traditions say. The crowd erupted into a chorus of whispers, some voices filled with admiration for Amadi's courage, others laced with disdain for what they saw as a betrayal of the old ways. The elders exchanged glances, their faces unreadable, as they processed what had just happened. Ginika felt a surge of relief, followed by a deep sense of gratitude. She squeezed Amadi's hand, her heart swelling with a mixture of emotions. She knew that his decision would not be without consequences, but for the first time in months, she felt a glimmer of hope. Izokoli, however, was not ready to let the matter rest. He stepped forward, his voice taking on a stern tone. Amadi, by rejecting this offer, you are defying the will of the elders and the traditions of our village. You are putting your family at risk. Do you truly understand what you are doing? Amadi met the elder's gaze, his resolve unwavering. I understand, Izokoli. But I will not allow tradition to destroy my family. We will find another way. Izokoli stared at him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he nodded slowly, though there was a hint of disappointment in his eyes. Very well, Amadi. The decision is yours. But know this, your actions will have consequences, and you will have to face them. With that, the elder turned and walked away, the other elders following close behind. The crowd began to disperse, the villagers exchanging whispers and speculative glances as they returned to their daily activities. Ginika and Amadi stood together in the center of the marketplace, the weight of what had just transpired settling over them. They had won a small victory, but they both knew that the battle was far from over. The village would not easily forget what had happened, and the pressure on Amadi to produce a male heir would only intensify. As they made their way back to their hut, Ginika felt a renewed sense of determination. She would not allow the village to tear their family apart, and she would do whatever it took to protect her daughter and her marriage. But as they walked hand in hand, Ginika couldn't shake the feeling that something dark was looming on the horizon, a storm that would test the strength of their bond in ways they had never imagined. The days following Amadi's decision were marked by an uneasy calm. The village of Udi seemed to settle back into its routine, but there was an undercurrent of tension that hung in the air like a storm cloud waiting to burst. The elders, though outwardly accepting of Amadi's choice, began to distance themselves from him, and the whispers that had once plagued his household now took on a more insidious tone. Ginika, ever vigilant, noticed the subtle shifts in the village's behavior. Women who had once greeted her warmly now avoided her gaze, and the men who had respected Amadi's opinion began to treat him with a quiet disdain. It was as if the entire village had collectively decided to ostracize them, punishing them for daring to defy tradition. Despite this, Amadi remained resolute in his decision. He threw himself into his work, determined to prove that his family could thrive without the approval of the elders. But the strain was beginning to show, both in his demeanor and in his relationship with Ginika. One evening, as they sat together in their small hut, Amadi spoke the words that Ginika had been dreading. Ginika, I've been thinking, maybe we should leave Udi. Ginika looked up from the stew she was stirring, her heart skipping a beat. Leave Udi? But this is our home, Amadi. Where would we go? I don't know, Amadi admitted, running a hand through his hair. But it's clear that we're no longer welcome here. The elders, the village, they'll never accept our family as it is. Maybe it's time we started fresh somewhere else. Ginika's mind raced with the implications of his words. Leaving Udi would mean abandoning everything they had ever known, their home, their friends, their history. But staying meant facing the increasing hostility of the village, a hostility that could eventually put their lives in danger. I don't want to leave, Ginika said quietly, her voice trembling with emotion. This is where Ifi was born, where we built our life together. But I also don't want to live in fear. Amadi sighed, his shoulders slumping in defeat. I don't want to live in fear either, Ginika. But what choice do we have? The village won't stop until they've broken us. Ginika reached out and took his hand, her grip firm. Then we won't let them break us. We'll stay and fight, Amadi. We'll fight for our family, for our daughter. We won't let them drive us out. Amadi looked at her, his eyes searching hers for any sign of doubt. But all he saw was the fierce determination that had drawn him to her in the first place. He nodded slowly, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. We'll fight, then. Together. And so, they stayed. But as the days turned into weeks, the tension in the village only grew. The elders began to openly question Amadi's leadership, spreading rumors that he had brought misfortune upon the village by defying the will of the gods. Superstition took hold, and soon, every misstep, every failed crop, every illness was blamed on Amadi and his family. The final straw came one fateful night when the village was struck by a terrible storm. The winds howled through the trees, tearing at the thatched roofs of the huts, and the rain poured down in sheets, flooding the narrow dirt paths that wound through the village. Lightning split the sky, and thunder rolled across the land, shaking the very foundations of Udi. As the storm raged, the villagers huddled inside their homes, praying for safety. But in the heart of the storm, a different kind of fear took hold, a fear that had been festering for months, fed by the whispers and rumors that had spread through the village like wildfire. In the dead of night, a small group of men gathered outside Amadi's hut. They were led by Oka, a man who had always been envious of Amadi's success and who now saw an opportunity to take what he believed was rightfully his. The men were armed with torches and machetes, their faces twisted with anger and fear. "This is his fault," Oka hissed, his voice barely audible above the roar of the wind. "The storm, the sickness, the failed crops, it's all because of him and his cursed family. The gods are angry, and they demand a sacrifice." The other men nodded in agreement, their eyes flickering with the reflection of the flames. They had been led to believe that Amadi's defiance of tradition had angered the gods, and now, in the grip of fear and superstition, they were willing to take matters into their own hands. Oka raised his torch, signaling the men to move forward. They approached the hut with silent determination, their footsteps muffled by the sound of the storm. The plan was simple: drag Amadi and his family out of their home and make an example of them. The gods had to be appeased, and if blood was the only way to do it, then so be it. Inside the hut, Ginika and Amadi were awake, huddled together with Ifi, trying to comfort her as the storm raged outside. The wind rattled the walls, and the roof threatened to give way under the relentless assault of the rain. Ifi clung to her mother, her small body trembling with fear. "Mama, I'm scared," she whimpered, burying her face in Ginika's chest. Ginika stroked her daughter's hair, trying to soothe her. "Sure, my love, it's going to be okay. The storm will pass." But even as she spoke the words, Ginika couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. There was a strange tension in the air, a sense that the storm was not the only danger they faced that night. Amadi felt it too. He had been on edge for days, sensing the growing hostility in the village, and now that unease had turned into a cold knot of dread in the pit of his stomach. He listened carefully, straining to hear anything beyond the noise of the storm. And then, through the howling wind, he heard it, the sound of footsteps outside the hut. "Ginika," he whispered urgently, his eyes wide with alarm. "There's someone outside." Ginika's heart skipped a beat. She tightened her hold on Ifi, her mind racing. "What do we do?" "We have to get out of here," Amadi replied, his voice trembling with fear and determination. "They're coming for us." He grabbed a machete from where it hung on the wall, then turned to Ginika, his eyes filled with a desperate resolve. "Take Ifi and go out the back. I'll hold them off." Ginika shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. "No, Amadi, I'm not leaving you." "You have to," Amadi insisted, his voice breaking. "I won't let them hurt you or our daughter. Please, Ginika, go." Ginika hesitated for only a moment before she nodded, her face pale with fear. She knew that Amadi was right. If they stayed together, they would all be caught. She scooped Ifi into her arms and hurried toward the back of the hut, her heart pounding in her chest. As she pushed open the back door, the wind nearly ripped it from her hands. Rain lashed at her face, and the darkness outside was nearly impenetrable, but she had no choice. She stepped out into the storm, clutching Ifi tightly, and began to run. Behind her, she heard the front door of the hut crash open, followed by shouts and the sound of a struggle. Ginika's heart ached with every step she took, knowing that Amadi was fighting for their lives, but she forced herself to keep moving. She didn't stop running until she reached the edge of the village, where the trees of the forest loomed like silent sentinels. There, she paused to catch her breath, her body trembling with fear and exhaustion. Ifi was crying softly, her small voice lost in the noise of the storm. It's okay, Iffy, Ginika whispered, her voice choked with emotion. We're safe now. We're going to be okay. But even as she spoke the words, she knew they were a lie. Nothing would ever be okay again, not after this night. She only hoped that Amadi would survive, that he would somehow find his way back to them. But deep down, she feared the worst. The storm raged on, and the darkness of the night seemed to stretch on forever. Ginika held Iffy close, her tears mingling with the rain, and waited for dawn, a dawn that would bring with it the harsh reality of what had happened in Udi that night. When the first light of morning finally broke through the clouds, the village of Udi lay in ruins. The storm had wreaked havoc on the thatched roofs and crops, leaving destruction in its wake. But for Ginika, the devastation outside was nothing compared to the devastation in her heart. She had spent the rest of the night huddled in the forest with Iffy, waiting for any sign of Amadi. But as the hours dragged on, her hope began to fade, replaced by a cold, numbing fear. When the storm finally passed, she knew she couldn't wait any longer. She had to return to the village, no matter what she might find. With Iffy still clutched to her chest, Ginika made her way back to Udi. The village was eerily silent, the usual morning bustle absent as the villagers surveyed the damage. Ginika's heart pounded in her chest as she approached their hut, her steps slowing as she drew closer. The front door hung from its hinges, broken and splintered, and the inside of the hut was a scene of chaos. Furniture was overturned, and the walls were streaked with blood. Ginika's breath caught in her throat as she stepped inside, her eyes searching frantically for any sign of Amadi. She found him lying on the floor, his body battered and blooded. For a moment, she couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Then, with a strangled cry, she rushed to his side, dropping to her knees beside him. Amadi, she gasped, her hands shaking as she reached out to touch his face. Amadi, please, wake up. He stirred slightly at the sound of her voice, his eyes fluttering open. Pain was etched into every line of his face, and his breathing was shallow and labored. But he was alive. Ginika, he whispered, his voice barely audible. Iffy, is she? She's safe, Ginika assured him, though her voice trembled with fear. We're both safe, Amadi. But you're hurt. We need to get you help. Amadi shook his head weakly, his eyes filled with sorrow. It's too late for me, Ginika. You have to be strong, for Iffy. No. Ginika cried, tears streaming down her face. I won't lose you, Amadi. I can't. Amadi's hand found hers, his grip weak but insistent. You won't lose me. I'll always be with you, with Iffy. But you have to go, now. Leave this place, before they come back. Ginika sobbed, her heart breaking as she clung to him. I can't leave you. I can't do this without you. You can, Amadi whispered, his voice fading. You're stronger than you know. Protect our daughter. Ginika. Promise me. Ginika nodded, though the words caught in her throat. I promise, Amadi. I promise. Amadi's eyes closed, a faint smile on his lips as he exhaled one final breath. Ginika's world shattered around her, her cries echoing through the empty hut as she held his lifeless body in her arms. Ginika felt as though time had ceased to exist as she sat there, holding Amadi's body. The storm had passed, but in its wake, it left a void that could never be filled. Iffy, sensing her mother's anguish, cried softly, clinging to Ginika's side. Ginika's tears mingled with the dirt on the floor, but she knew she could not stay there forever. The promise she made to Amadi echoed in her mind. She had to be strong for Iffy. She had to protect her daughter. Ginika gently laid Amadi's body down, brushing a hand over his eyes to close them. Then, with trembling hands, she gathered what little they had and prepared to leave the village that had once been their home. As she stepped out of the hut, the sun was rising, casting a pale light over the destruction. The villagers were slowly emerging, surveying the damage with weary eyes. Ginika moved quietly, her heart heavy, avoiding the gazes of those she once called neighbors. She knew she had to leave Udi before anyone noticed her departure. The village had already turned against her and her family, and she feared what they might do if they realized she was still there. She slipped into the forest, carrying Iffy on her back, and set out on a path that led away from the village, away from everything she had ever known. Ginika walked for hours, her feet aching, but she did not stop. The weight of Amadi's death pressed on her like a heavy stone, but she pushed forward, driven by a single purpose, to protect her daughter. The forest around her was dense and unfamiliar, and she had no idea where she was headed. All she knew was that she had to keep moving. As the day wore on, Ginika began to feel the strain of her journey. Iffy was growing heavier on her back, and her own exhaustion was becoming unbearable. She stumbled through the undergrowth, her vision blurred by tears and fatigue, until finally, she could go no further. She collapsed under the shade of a large tree, cradling Iffy in her arms. The child was exhausted, her small body limp against Ginika's chest. Ginika closed her eyes, her mind filled with memories of Amadi, of their life together, of everything they had lost. "I'm sorry, Amadi," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "I'm so sorry." Ginika fell into a restless sleep, haunted by dreams of the storm, of the night that had taken everything from her. In her dreams, she saw Amadi reaching out to her, his eyes full of sorrow and love. But no matter how hard she tried, she could never reach him. Ginika awoke to the sound of birdsong, the morning sun filtering through the leaves above her. For a moment, she didn't know where she was. But then, the weight of reality crashed down on her, and she remembered everything. Iffy was still asleep in her arms, her small face peaceful despite the turmoil they had endured. Ginika kissed her daughter's forehead, then gently set her down on a patch of soft grass. She stood and looked around, trying to get her bearings. The forest was dense and unfamiliar, but Ginika knew she had to find a way out. She couldn't stay there, hiding from the world. She needed to find a new place to start over, a place where she and Iffy could be safe. As she walked, Ginika began to notice signs of a path through the forest, a trail of broken branches, the faint outline of a footpath worn into the ground. She followed it, hoping it would lead her to safety. Hours passed, and just as Ginika began to fear she would be lost in the forest forever, she emerged into a clearing. Before her was a small village, much like Udi, but with an air of peace and simplicity that eased the tension in her heart. Ginika hesitated at the edge of the clearing, uncertain whether she would be welcomed or turned away. But she had no other choice. She had to find shelter, food, and safety for Iffy. She took a deep breath and stepped forward. The villagers noticed her arrival and approached cautiously. An elderly woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile was the first to speak. "Who are you, child? And what brings you to our village?" the woman asked, her voice filled with concern. "My name is Ginika," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "This is my daughter, Iffy. We've lost our home. We seek shelter and safety." The woman looked at Ginika, then at Iffy, who was clutching her mother's hand. She saw the weariness and sorrow in Ginika's eyes and knew that this was a woman who had endured great hardship. "You're safe here," the woman said softly. "Come, we'll take care of you." Ginika felt tears welling up in her eyes, but this time they were tears of relief. She followed the woman into the village, grateful beyond words for the kindness of strangers. Days turned into weeks, and slowly, Ginika began to adjust to life in the new village. The villagers were kind and understanding, offering her food, clothing, and a place to stay. Ginika took on small tasks to contribute to the community, determined to earn her keep and repay their kindness. Iffy, too, began to thrive in their new home. The other children welcomed her into their games, and the villagers treated her with the same affection they showed their own. Seeing her daughter smile again brought a flicker of hope to Ginika's heart, a hope that had been nearly extinguished by the events in Udi. But despite the peace they had found, Ginika could not shake the memories of the past. At night, she still dreamed of Amadi, of the storm that had taken him from her, and of the village that had turned its back on them. She carried the weight of his loss with her every day, a burden that seemed too heavy to bear. One evening, as Ginika sat outside their small hut, watching the sun set over the horizon, the elderly woman who had welcomed her into the village came to sit beside her. "You've been through much, my child," the woman said gently, her voice filled with compassion. "But you're strong. Stronger than you realize." Ginika nodded, her eyes focused on the fading light. "I try to be strong for Ifi. But some days, it feels like the pain will never go away." The woman placed a hand on Ginika's shoulder, a comforting gesture. "Grief is a heavy burden, and it takes time to heal. But you have a new life here, a new beginning. And you're not alone." Ginika looked at the woman, tears brimming in her eyes. "I miss him so much. I don't know how to move on." "You don't have to forget him to move forward," the woman replied softly. "Amadi will always be with you, in your heart, in your memories. But you must live for the living. For Ifi, and for yourself." Ginika wiped away her tears, the woman's words resonating deep within her. She knew that she had to find a way to heal, to let go of the pain that had been consuming her. For Ifi's sake, and for her own, she needed to embrace the life they had been given. "I'll try," Ginika said, her voice stronger now. "I'll try to live for us." The woman smiled, a warm and comforting presence in the growing darkness. "That's all anyone can ask, my child. One step at a time." Months passed, and the seasons changed. Ginika and Ifi continued to build a new life in the village, their hearts slowly mending as time worked its quiet magic. Ginika took comfort in the rhythm of daily life, in the warmth of the community that had embraced them, and in the joy of watching her daughter grow. But the memory of Amadi remained, a quiet presence that Ginika carried with her, even as she learned to smile again. She often visited the forest where they had taken refuge on that fateful night, finding solace in the peacefulness of the trees, in the gentle rustling of the leaves. One day, as Ginika sat by a stream that ran through the forest, Ifi playing nearby, she felt a sense of peace that she had not known in a long time. The pain of the past was still there, but it no longer dominated her every thought. Instead, it had become a part of her, woven into the fabric of her being, a reminder of all that she had lost, but also of all that she had gained. Ginika watched Ifi, her daughter's laughter ringing through the air, and felt a warmth spread through her chest. She knew that Amadi would have wanted her to be happy, to find joy in the life they had created, even if it was without him. As she sat there, the sun shining down on her, Ginika realized that she had found a new purpose, a new strength within herself. She was a mother, a protector, a survivor. And while the scars of the past would always be with her, she knew now that they did not have to define her. She stood up, brushing the dirt from her clothes, and walked over to Ifi. The little girl looked up at her mother with a beaming smile, her eyes full of innocence and hope. Ginika knelt down beside her, smoothing a stray lock of hair from Ifi's face. "Are you happy here, my love?" Ginika asked softly. Ifi nodded, her smile widening. "Yes, Mama. I like it here. I have friends, and everyone is so nice." Ginika's heart swelled with emotion as she gazed at her daughter. The darkness that had once overshadowed their lives seemed to be lifting, replaced by the warmth of a new beginning. She knew that their journey was far from over, but for the first time in a long while, Ginika felt a sense of hope. "We'll be okay," Ginika whispered, more to herself than to Ifi. "We'll be just fine." Ifi wrapped her small arms around her mother, resting her head against Ginika's chest. "I love you, Mama," she murmured. Ginika held her daughter close, the words a balm to her wounded soul. "I love you too, Ifi. More than anything in this world." As they stood there, bathed in the golden light of the setting sun, Ginika knew that they had found their place in the world. The village had become their home, a place where they could heal, grow, and start anew. The pain of the past would never fully disappear, but it no longer had the power to control their future. Ginika took Ife's hand, and together they walked back toward the village. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, Ginika felt ready to face whatever challenges lay in store. She had found her strength, her purpose, and most importantly, she had found the light that would guide her through the darkest of times. As they approached the village, Ginika looked up at the sky, the stars beginning to twinkle in the growing dusk. She knew that Amadi was watching over them, his spirit a constant presence in their lives. And she knew that, no matter what happened, they would always carry his memory in their hearts. With Ife by her side and the love of their community surrounding them, Ginika felt a deep sense of peace. They had survived the storm, and now, they would embrace the light of tomorrow, together. Years passed, and the village continued to flourish. Ginika and Ife became integral members of the community, their resilience and kindness leaving a lasting impact on everyone they met. The villagers often spoke of Ginika's strength and how she had overcome unimaginable loss to build a new life for herself and her daughter. Ife grew into a bright, joyful young woman, her laughter a constant source of happiness for Ginika. She excelled in her studies and became known for her compassion and wisdom, traits she had inherited from her parents. As Ife grew, Ginika often shared stories of their past, of Amadi, and the life they had once lived in Udi. These stories became a way for Ife to know her father, to understand the love and sacrifice that had shaped her life. On the anniversary of Amadi's passing, Ginika and Ife would visit the forest where they had first found refuge. They would sit by the stream, sharing memories and honoring the man who had given everything to protect them. Though the pain of loss never fully left Ginika, it became a quiet part of her, a reminder of the love that had carried her through the darkest times. She had learned to live with the silence, to cradle it gently within her heart, where it would always be safe. And as the years turned into decades, Ginika knew that the light of tomorrow would continue to shine, not just for her, but for Ife and all the generations to come. The darkness had not defeated them, it had only made them stronger. In the end, it was the love that endured, a love that transcended time and space, binding them together even in the face of loss. And that love, Ginika knew, would never fade. It would carry them forward, always, into the light.